Laskin Corla. We've known deadly disease on our island before. In the 1800s, the Great Hunger saw millions emigrate or die from famine, but also diphtheria, cholera, fever and smallpox. In the last century, TB, consumption, destroyed thousands of lives. It may be folk memory now, but its legacy lingers on. It took the vision of a socialist, Noel Brown, to deliver the infrastructure and the drive that tackled that insidious disease. But the vision of a social public health system was blocked by vested interests, and it has yet to be realised. We must not repeat the same mistake made then, the mistake of not finishing his job. This emergency tells us we need to build an Irish National Health Service, of which we can all be proud. Ministers, that work should have started today. Instead, we are again papering over the cracks. In times of crisis, it is the state we turn to, and we still have some way to go before we can end our two-tier health system. But today, I am just as concerned about our two-tier economy. This government promised a shared future. The Taoiseach Micheál Martin, when he was campaigning against Fine Gael, promised us an Ireland for all. But instead we have two Irelands here today. Billions of euros extra in supports for businesses, but cuts for workers on the PUP, and no shame whatsoever about it. We were told there would be no cuts, but a form of austerity is back for those who can least afford to carry it. The time has come to reimagine this state. And that's why Labour has proposed a package of measures worth well in excess of €11 billion in capital and current spending to plug the gaps in our services and to do whatever it takes to save jobs and lives. Unapologetically, our focus is on the interests of working people. Right when we needed a radical response, a different approach, a shared national effort, the dividing lines have been drawn. And after 4 years of the on-again, off-again, difficult engagement that was confidence supply, we finally got the wedding ceremony back in June. Today the marriage was consummated, but the wedding speeches did not live up to expectations. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael has now become one, for better or for worse. And for the sake of the country, I hope that the next few months beat their disastrous honeymoon period of self-inflicted cock-ups, exploding clown cars and comical games of one-upmanship. We don't need to do a deep dive through departmental records to uncover any major policy differences between the two ministers present here today. If we did, we simply wouldn't be able to find them, because there are none. So tight are you both policy-wise that by the time this government is done, we will be wondering which one of you is which. Fianna Fáil has been subsumed by Fine Gael. The merger is complete, and Fianna Fáil's identity, long cherished, is gone. All of that being said, it would of course be churlish of me and my party colleagues not to recognise that there is much in this package to welcome. Who does not want to see extra resources targeted at health, housing, education and wage supports? But the question is, will it be enough to stave off the twin threats of COVID-19 and the prospect of a no-trade deal Brexit? The national credit card has been maxed out, but where is the money going? There is no shortage of cash, but we know from our experience that you will come up short on implementation. And will this package be sufficient to insulate our economy against future shocks and reshape our society and our economy into one that is more resilient and more fair? We know that the pandemic has exposed massive gaps in our health service. Just a matter of months ago, a chronic lack of ICU and acute beds saw us have to go cap in hand to the private sector to get access to beds, because we feared that our health service would be overrun. And an extra 60 or so new ICU beds, Minister, does not a National Health Service make. If this does not force this House and this Government into a radical rethink of our priorities as a country, then I really do worry for our future. And last March, it wasn't Michael O'Leary and the captains of industry who rode to our rescue. He was too busy flying people to Cheltenham in the middle of a deadly pandemic. It was the doctors, the nurses, the healthcare assistants, the hospital porters, the home helps, the shop workers, bus drivers, teachers teaching our kids via Zoom, who all battled to keep us well and our society and economy moving. It was the state to which we turned to protect us and to keep us all out of harm's way. Only the state has the authority, the skills and the resources to respond to the scale of the unprecedented emergency we faced and will continue to face into 2021. It was to the state that private business turned to provide a lifeline and support enterprises and jobs in a way that would have been simply unthinkable at the start of this year. In doing so, we avoided collectively turning a crisis into a catastrophe. Ministers, this pandemic should be an inflection point, a turning point for our country. A point at which we say there should be no going back to poor levels of investment in public services compared to our EU peers. No going back to a model of low pay and precarious work. No going back to the precarity of being a missed shift or two away from eviction from your home. No going back to a reliance on the private sector to provide education for our toddlers and care for our parents and grandparents. It's time for a new social contract for the Irish people. And it goes to show how things have changed when even IBEC says that the future involves one where the state is bigger, where it does more, and where those costs will have to be met. The last few months have shone a light on some uncomfortable truths. A health service that struggles despite the best efforts of our health workers. Weaknesses in our private model of early years education. Massive overdependence on the private housing and rental market to put a roof over the heads of low-paid workers. Will Budget 2021 mark an important milestone on the way to a better, fairer and more sustainable Ireland? It should, but I doubt that it will. On today's evidence, it seems to me that it may very well be back to business as usual for Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael once we get over this hump. We know that international conditions have never been more favourable to borrow so we can invest. Ministers, I implore you both to shed your conservative instincts, to pull out all the stops and invest multiples of the capital allocations you announced today on housing, health and education, and do it now. It's time, as Chris Johns wrote in yesterday's Irish Times, to show truly radical solidarity with those who, through no fault of their own, are suffering the most. Every single discussion I've had with a journalist in the last few weeks ahead of Budget 2021 has asked me this: how are we going to pay for all these things you said we should do? Now, like any prudent and sensible business or household, we borrow now to build back better for tomorrow. And yes, we are all seared by the experience of the last crash, a crisis that was caused by lax regulation of banks and of property and credit orgy not seen anywhere in the world. The response to the last crash from the international community and the lenders of last resort meant that the 2008 crisis lasted much longer than it should have. Fianna Fáil and the Green Party, of course, signed us up to a programme of tough medicine. And lessons from the international response to that last crisis should be learned and they should be applied today. The actions of the European Central Bank has meant that just last week Ireland could borrow €1.5 billion at negative interest rates on a 10-year bond. Now, COVID-19 has very few silver linings, but the one saving grace is the cheap long-term borrowing that's available to us. Even the IMF is telling us to invest in capital projects, and now. But we cannot fight this war with old weapons from the last one. As Keynes said, the difficulty lies not in the new ideas, but in escaping from the old ones. And I see both of you now are agonising already in the context of your budget speeches about how we get the deficit down. This government must be ambitious for Ireland to invest in building homes, schools, hospitals, colleges, metro links and other important pieces of infrastructure. That's the prudent and the sensible thing to do right now. Let's do whatever it takes to maintain jobs and incomes. Instead, in my view, and based on what we've seen today, you are doing as little as you can get away with. And in relation to capital programmes, I note that, in fact, you're likely only to spend about an extra €600 million this year on top of what you had already proposed, not the €2 billion that was suggested by the Labour Party. This budget, in the view of the Labour Party, should be the first step on the road to a new social contract forged between the citizens of this state and the state itself. And we will judge this budget on three bases. Does it do enough to protect workers, families and communities in their hour of need? Will it fulfil the key role of the state in looking after the health and well-being of our citizens? Does it usher in a new era, a new social contract and a definitive move away from the tired Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil offering of tax cuts and poor delivery on housing, health and other social services? Ministers, hundreds of thousands of families are watching in this afternoon for signs of hope for the future. Some might be watching in as they work from home. They might be working for a successful multinational corporation, and thankfully they are doing very well. Their performance has been a saving grace for our economy, and that advantage has to be protected and built upon. Others who are watching may have worked in a pub or a restaurant all of their lives. They used to be at work at this time of the day doing a job they loved, and they lost that job through no fault of their own or no fault of the business that employed them. They need our support, and they are the victims of this two-tier economy. The best way we can provide certainty to workers and businesses at this anxious time is to provide them with security that the wages will be paid. And there can be no cliff edge when the wage subsidy scheme expires in March. And Ministers, you have signalled today that you will provide support for wages and challenged businesses beyond next April. This is good, but we need to do much more. We can use such investment in enterprises and workers to drive change, to improve business models, to upskill workers, to enhance pay and the performance of our economy more generally. This is the time to do radical things, to spend money correctly to keep people at work, because we know that it is easier to maintain a job than to create a new one. And that is why Labour has proposed a new wage subsidy and short-time work scheme called Oireachtas. It's based on the German Kurzarbeit model that saved 500,000 jobs in Germany in the last recession. And we should use the money allocated to the EWSS and add on an additional €2.7 billion from the Brexit and COVID contingency funds to fund such a lifeline for businesses and workers. And of course, as Minister McGrath pointed out earlier on, the European Shore Scheme is available to assist us in the spending that we will need to do over the next couple of years to keep people in work and to upskill and retrain workers. And this all can be done and should become a permanent feature of our labour market. Minister Donoghue admitted to me 2 weeks ago at the Budgetary Oversight Committee that if this scheme were in place when the crisis took hold, then we could have saved hundreds, if not thousands, of more businesses and jobs. And what we need to do as well is attach conditions to the businesses that benefit from these kinds of schemes. Fair conditions, conditions to drive the agenda of decent work, and to ensure that those who are benefiting from state largesse over the next period of time do not lay off their workers. And I get the plans, and I understand the plans that the ministers have announced today to cut the VAT rate for hospitality. I get that they might be politically popular, but experience tells us that this initiative will not do what you seem to think it will. This isn't 2008 or 2011. Hospitality doesn't have a demand problem. It has a confidence and public health problem. There's an additional €7 billion saved in Irish bank accounts by those who are at work. Yes, keep hospitality alive with business grants and various reliefs and incentives, the likes of which form part of today's package, and keep them alive with the kind of wage subsidy scheme that we are proposing. The money's there, and the money's there to help those businesses when they can reopen again. Just at the moment, the conditions to spend it aren't there. The VAT cut proposed runs the risk of becoming, unfortunately, another deadweight policy, spending a couple of billion here and there to promote economic activity that would have happened regardless. We do agree, though, that the hospitality sector does require support. They provide jobs in towns and villages right across Ireland and are entitled to our support. But it is worth recalling that the last time the VAT rate was cut for that industry, that did not improve the experience of customers in terms of cost, and it didn't improve the experience of workers in terms of their pay packets. But if you're determined to do this, then make the cut contingent on engagement by the sector and the Joint Labour Committee they continue to veto. This is how an activist state drives change and positive outcomes for the common good. And it really does baffle me that we can spend billions on state support for businesses and pay no interest whatsoever in changing the lives of those who work in those industries for the better. Look at the €50 million a week new business support scheme that's proposed today. This is the equivalent of a full €350 a week PUP payment for 150,000 laid-off workers, the payment that this government refuses to restore. Almost uniquely in Europe, this government and its predecessor has chosen to pump limitless amounts of cash into the business sector without any conditions whatsoever around improving the lives of workers. 40% of young people who are not in education or training are now unemployed. Given the pressure under which the sectors they work are in, there are very few options available to them. We know to our cost in this country the scarring effect that unemployment has on young people. The experience stays with them forever. They can't emigrate. They currently have few opportunities here. This government needs to give them hope for a better future. Do not leave them behind. We have to declare war on youth unemployment. We may have to accept the reality that many jobs that were lost will not come back. We say invest now in almost 30,000 new jobs in training places, in green tech, retrofitting engineering and so on, and deepen and broaden the spectrum and availability of apprenticeships, traineeships and education places today. Young people today should be given the same kind of chance that I had back in the 1990s, the chance to be the first member of my extended family to attend university, thanks to the reforms and free fees brought in by Niamh Bronagh of the Labour Party. We proposed this year spending €80 million, knocking €1,000 off the student contribution charge. The Minister for Education should do the same on the way to a fully publicly funded third-level system. It's deeply distressing that this government has chosen to deprive workers of the full rate of the pandemic unemployment payment. If €350 was the floor of decency in March, it should be a floor of decency now too. The government has told us that the pandemic unemployment payment will be available for arts workers and those who are self-employed operating in the arts and entertainment sectors and other exposed sectors. We'll give your scheme a cautious welcome, but the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. If we do not get this right, we are in serious danger of losing an entire generation of artists and technicians and infrastructure built up over decades, and we will live to regret that. But the reality of life, say for a sound technician or a lighting technician, is that they might get a gig worth about €1,000, maybe for a night, 2 days, whatever the case might be. In this climate, this might be the only work that they might end up getting for an entire month. Will they be allowed to average this out over a period of weeks to enable them to stay within the eligibility criteria? Because that's unclear to me. Furthermore, on the pandemic unemployment payment, will this government just decide to pay it to anyone who has lost their job and is on the pandemic unemployment payment this Christmas? And can we also please drop the name Christmas bonus? It's patronising, it's offensive, and it suggests that someone who depends on the state for their income should be grateful for an extra week's payment at a challenging time of the year. There's a lot of talk about flattening the debt curve, but what about the poverty curve? Laskin Corla, this budget will not go down well with continuity Fianna Fáil. One of that party's many former agriculture ministers wants the PUP to go back up. His retreat to the backbenches has coincided with a newfound concern for the jobless. It's a pity he couldn't find his voice when the cabinet of which he was a member agreed to slash the payment back in July. I agree with Willie O'Dea when he said you can't cultivate social solidarity if you're implementing cuts to people on already low incomes. These fine words from the keepers of the Fianna Fáil flame who are self-isolating on the backbenches won't pay the rent for the 25,000 young people on the €203 lower rate of the PUP, for example. And turning to this government's approach to social welfare, it seems that they believe that there are two categories of citizens on social welfare, the deserving and the undeserving. I agree that those who are living alone require enhanced support, but all of those who are on fixed incomes do too. Unlike Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and even Sinn Féin, we believe that all of those on weekly social welfare payments should see a rise of €5 per week, and that includes pensioners. Now, we know that Sinn Féin is good at rewriting history, but today they wanted to rewrite their own alternative budget proposals. They didn't last Friday propose an additional €5 a week on each weekly social welfare payment, merely €3. We propose this €5 rate because of the threat of rising food and utility costs as a result of the prospect of a no-trade deal Brexit. The impact of this on the ability of a welfare recipient to make ends meet should be clear to everybody. And this government has yet again failed to address the real needs of carers in this society. The rather tokenistic changes that are going to be made around income credits and the small addition to the respite grant doesn't cut the mustard. The unsung heroes that keep their loved ones at home and care for them night and day, 365 days a year. It's time we started showing them the love and respect that they need by recognising the work they do. This year was the year we should have gone to town on the income disregard and provided the carers grant to all. Another missed opportunity to recalibrate this unequal society of ours. And we had fine words, as usual, from the Taoiseach about the value we place on lower paid workers in this country, the people who kept our health service going and our shops open when the first wave hit. These were empty words. A candle in the window as a tokenistic mark of gratitude won't heat the homes of those on the national minimum wage who will only receive an extra 10 cent an hour increase to their hourly rate of pay next year. Virtue signalling from Leo Varadkar won't put food on the table. A government that genuinely believes we were all in this together didn't have to accept the recommendations of the Low Pay Commission. But they did, and they've turned their back on those they applauded earlier on this year. This isn't the start of a new social contract, it's just business as usual. And where was the Green Party when this memo came to the Cabinet table last week? This shows when push comes to shove, they cannot be counted on to stand up for ordinary low-paid workers, despite all of their rhetoric about social justice. But should we be surprised? The Green Party has form here. When the last crash hit, the first thing they did, along with Fianna Fáil, was slash the national minimum wage by €1 an hour. And it did not create a single job. It only succeeded in driving thousands of workers further into penury. There are also many of these low-paid workers to whom this government continues to deny a right that almost every other European takes for granted, the right to statutory sick pay. If this is a COVID budget, where is the right to sick pay? This government is throwing money at the business sector, grants, reliefs, wage schemes and the like, yet they are washing their hands of sick workers during a worldwide pandemic. 87% of the public supports Labour's statutory sick pay bill, and the acting CMO, as we know, has spoken about the importance of decent sick pay as a weapon against the virus when he was in temporary charge. You've kicked this down the road again for at least another 6 months, and when we need it now. And we've proposed that we make illness benefit available after the second day, not the third day, as this government is doing, at a cost of €70 million. And we have suggested a levy on the meat sector to fund sick pay too. Action is needed now on sick pay, not next year, when in fact we could have a vaccine available before the kind of sick pay scheme that you say you're interested in. This is a shameful state of affairs. I also note as well that you've allocated monies to merely delay the rise in the pension age to 67. And where is the job seekers transition payment? There's no sign of that in the documents that I've seen. I can't see the money for that. So you haven't even done half the job you're supposed to do. We don't want this delayed. We don't want it deferred. It should be dumped, taken off the agenda once and for all. The legislation should be amended. End of story. Otherwise, this will create a dangerous cliff edge every year for hard-working people who should be entitled to retire when they originally expected to. Much more could have been done in this budget to genuinely make life better and more hopeful for the lower paid and for those who rely on the state for their incomes. And this budget really does beg the question, are we, as this government constantly asks us, are we all in this together? Not so sure that we are. The pandemic has shown that chickens have come home to roost because of years of underinvestment in public services. We know, and we've paid the price, at the fact that Ireland has the lowest level of critical care beds in Europe, the lowest level of hospital consultants and the highest waiting lists, with currently 850,000 people waiting for care. Despite years of delays regarding the implementation of Sláinte care, we were able to effectively nationalise private hospitals practically overnight in March when we feared the worst. We need a healthcare system that works not only in a time of crisis, but works for everyone, all of the time. We shouldn't wait another 5 or 10 years for a change that we now know can and must happen. Ministers will tell us this week that we have the largest ever investment in health. It's not about the quantum of money, it's about what ministers will do with it, how they will implement the things they say they will do today. During the first few months of the COVID-19 outbreak, the government spent a massive €115 million per month in private hospitals, which are only run at just a third of capacity. And rather than outsourcing our healthcare system to the private sector, the state could have stepped in to directly nationalise at least 2 private hospitals for an estimated cost of €450 million, as we set out in Labour's alternative budget last week and as articulated very well by my party colleague and party leader Alan Kelly. This would have been a bold but a necessary first step towards a single-tier public healthcare system, an Irish National Health Service that serves everyone, and it would help us deliver on a vital component of a new social contract for the Irish people. And it would have assured us this winter of the necessary capacity we need in our hospitals as we face into a second surge of COVID-19. But there's also a risk in terms of health of another surge, an apocalyptic surge in the non-COVID-19 waiting lists and subsequent non-COVID deaths. We've warned you all of this. My party colleague Alan Kelly is blue in the face, reminding ministers, successive ministers, of the dangers associated with this. Too many people have suffered due to the inability of our health service to cope with the pressure. We know that timely treatment of patients is crucial in terms of survival rates for a whole host of conditions, including cancer, stroke and heart disease. Yet the government has done little or nothing to ensure screening services remain open and bring it back up to the levels that it should be at, or indeed to reduce our sky-high waiting lists. In our own alternative budget, we propose €35 million in additional funding for cancer services, cancer screening and the cardiac care backlog. And we welcome the resources that government says they will put into these services this year. But there is no plan, there is no detail on how we get cancer care back on track. We need that detail. Those watching at home need that detail. Those who are concerned about their own health and the health of their family members need that detail, and we need it today. There's nothing either to support our creaking ambulance service, our first line of defence in this country. Nothing. And nothing, tragically, on a terminal illness card that we've been waiting for far too long. That would make the difference to so many people, to so many people's lives and the remainder of the time that they have with us. Free GP care is also a critical component to early intervention and prevention of COVID-19 and non-COVID illnesses. And we made the important first steps, but Fine Gael has dragged its feet on major extensions to this scheme. The government's winter plan has finally acknowledged the need to treat people in the community as part of, that winter plan process. And necessity, however, is the mother of invention. Such talk of community care that we've heard in recent times is cheap when 1 in 5 primary care centres does not yet have a GP, while many more lack basic diagnostic equipment. And our own alternative budget has set aside €40 million to fast-track community diagnostic and assessment hubs to make sure that we can take pressure off our acute hospitals at this very, very difficult time. Nowhere has poor policy making and waste of public funds been more evident than in the mismanagement of our housing system by both Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. Any new social contract has to finally address the running sore that has bedevilled our country for far too long, and that is the issue of housing. My parents, a factory worker and a confectioner in a local bakery, on modest wages, could afford to buy a home back in the 1970s and rear 2 kids in it. They knew if they couldn't get a mortgage that they could rely on accessing a decent home from the council. Both of these aspirations we used to take for granted, but they are now unrealisable for far too many. I've been a public representative for 21 years now, and never before have I witnessed so much precarity, anxiety and sense of hopelessness around our housing situation from the people that I represent. This budget promises much on social and affordable housing, but in terms of the track record of delivery, that would warn us to be very sceptical about today's headline-grabbing announcements. To the end of June of this year, only 1,500 public homes have been delivered this year. This is shocking and does not inspire confidence at all. There is simply no substitute for building social and affordable houses we can call home. In the statement earlier on, Minister McGrath has said this government will build 9,000 social homes next year. I don't buy that for 1 minute. That's nowhere near the kind of resources that my colleague Senator Rebecca Moynihan has identified to allow us to build an additional 2,000 on top of those already committed in the National Development Plan. And when you think about it, we're going to spend considerable sums of money building social homes next year, but we're going to be spending more on supporting housing assistance payment rental agreements. 15,000 HAP agreements will be supported next year by this government, when those resources should be focused and targeted on public and affordable homes. You should do, as we have suggested, build an extra 2,000 local authority homes next year on publicly owned land. You could also do, as we suggest, and provide another €500 million for seed financing for at least 4,000 affordable rental homes and 4,000 extra affordable homes per year under our housing plan, which envisages €16 billion being spent over a 5-year period to build 80,000 new homes in this country. As a result of this budget, we have seen the continued subsidising of the inflated house prices we're experiencing at the moment and the support for higher earners through the continuation of a really bogus Help to Buy scheme. Minister, you should get rid of this Help to Buy scheme now. The ESRI has called this a poorly designed scheme, while a 2019 analysis by the Parliamentary Budget Office showed that the pre-existing scheme generated a deadweight loss of over 41%. What a waste of public money. Put simply, taxpayers' money is being used to subsidise home purchases for those who can already afford to buy. Yet despite all of this evidence, the very first act of Minister O'Brien was to both extend and enhance the level of subsidy provided under this failed scheme. And he's doing it again today. This is reckless. It's not only reckless, it's plain stupid. This isn't a policy on housing, it's a policy for developers. And scrapping this policy alone would have saved €102 million, which could have been ring-fenced for homelessness prevention measures or affordable homes. And the shared equity scheme and this extension to the Help to Buy scheme, what it is really is an extension of state money to developers. That's all it is, nothing more, nothing less. Neither have we seen a new site value tax on undeveloped land, or a levy indeed that could be imposed on empty houses worth about €200 as proposed by Social Justice Ireland. It's estimated that these kinds of measures alone would have yielded €75 million for local authorities in 2021, money that's badly needed now due to the massive drop-off in commercial rates and cuts to the local property tax as implemented by Sinn Féin, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael across the country. Labour would have also provided a €15 million rental arrears fund to help those through the worst of the crisis as part of our new deal for renters. And we also would have returned to the idea of rent freezes. We know well about rent freezes and we know they can be done. Alan Kelly knows they can be done. It's been done before. And the resistance from this government and your predecessor to really fixing the problem for renters is scandalous and will come back, I think, to haunt you. And our vision of a new social contract would not only be about more homes, but also about sustainable communities. And that's why we have proposed very significant interventions in terms of home retrofitting and in supports for local authorities and communities across the country to make sure that our towns, our villages are livable places. We need investment in our towns and in our communities to make that happen. On carbon taxes, Labour's alternative budget proposed to ring-fence part of the revenue from a €10 increase that we've proposed, €2.50 more than the government's €7.50 increase. And we would use that to fund a significant national home insulation programme and also to provide an extra 4 weeks on the winter fuel allowance and additional several euros on top of the weekly payment. This is very important this year, as we know that older people in particular will be spending much more time at home as a result of the pandemic, cocooning and keeping themselves safe. I'm intrigued at the references made earlier on today to the National Economic Recovery Fund. While a figure has been mentioned, we're still not clear on precisely what amount of money is going to be in that fund and what that fund is going to be used for. Interestingly, both current ministers and previous ministers have managed over the last few months to escape the gaze of the Dáil in terms of the eye-watering sums of money that we have spent to take on COVID-19 in this year. The Fiscal Advisory Council and the Parliamentary Budget Office and others have criticised the fact that there has been little or no Dáil oversight of your spending so far this year. Performance indicators have been dispensed with. Trust us, you said. Fianna Fáil, frankly, has to earn our trust again, and we know how wasteful that party can be with taxpayers' money. We've lived with the consequences of that over the last decades. But from the figures that have been mentioned here today, under €4 billion, and the limited detail you've made available, the Economic Recovery Fund stands well short of the €10 billion multi-annual stimulus fund that the Fiscal Advisory Council has proposed. Any fund or stimulus needs to be big enough to make a real difference. This looks wide of the mark and displays, yet again, a massive lack of ambition from this government. I want to now, Minister, have an uncomfortable conversation, and that's one about tax. And by God, does this country need a grown-up conversation about tax. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael sees tax as a burden people have to carry. The less workers and businesses pay, the better. That's your settled view. For me and my party, tax is an investment. Levied fairly, it can open up enormous possibilities to help make our country work better and our economy work more fairly. Any of us who have served in government take pride in the fact that we have a progressive tax system in this country. Those who have the most pay the most. This has been borne out by the fact that income tax receipts and corporation tax receipts have held up exceptionally well during this crisis. Yet a read of the latest figures also exposes a massive underlying risk. We're far too dependent on vulnerable corporation tax revenue to fund our state. 1 in 5 of every euro taken in tax receipts is from corporation tax. What's more, the bulk of it is generated from a small handful of companies. Our tax base needs to be made more sustainable and it must be broadened out. In the 10 years since the last crash, we've replaced an over-reliance on stamp duty and property transactions with an over-reliance on corporation tax. This is a game of Russian roulette with our future. I agree that we must defend our right to set and maintain a corporation tax rate of 12.5%, but I also agree that that should be an effective minimum rate of corporation tax and that reliefs and so on should be avoided. Everybody should pay corporation tax. Everybody should pay a fair share. It's an important element, but not the only one, of our offering in terms of good jobs and investment. With most of our eggs in one basket, it is very dangerous that this programme for government has meant that the government has tied its own hands in refusing to even countenance a conversation on higher taxes, even on the much better off in this country, over the lifetime of this government. You could, for example, have listened to the Labour Party and generated £250 million more by removing tax credits on all incomes over €100,000 by tapering them. You chose not to. It's bizarre that even in a time like this, when departmental officials are worrying themselves to sleep at night about the deficit, that the very same department refuses costings to me on the introduction of a net wealth tax for Ireland. The same people who worry about our sustainability of our borrowing levels are the same ones who won't even give a moment's thought to generating some more income from taxing unearned inherited wealth, gambling in shares, massive pension pots that have grown thanks to tax reliefs on indeed property, the asset in which most wealth is held in this country. We have shown you, Minister, how €1.8 billion can be raised by targeting wealth and assets, but this government chooses to look the other way. And on the taxing of property, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have more in common with Sinn Féin than either would care to admit. Sinn Féin is now preparing for government, of course, and as their cowardly policy on property taxes exposes, they are about as prepared to tax wealth as Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil are. That's the truth. That's been the experience. The evidence is there. It's a strange party of the left that says it doesn't see property, land and wealth as an asset. In fact, Sinn Féin want to cut the tax on a millionaire's mansion by 20%, according to their own alternative budget, leaving our cash-starved councils even more vulnerable than they already are financially. This is rank hypocrisy of the worst kind. It's eminently possible, Minister, to design a tax on wealth that does not impact on jobs and businesses, but the will simply does not exist. I agree with what Minister Donoghue said earlier on. We need a Commission on Taxation and Welfare. My party has called for that for some time. We need to have a closer look under the bonnet as to how our taxation and welfare system works and how they interact so we can better support employment and business in this country. Pragmatic business leaders who care about our country understand that we need to have a mature, grown-up conversation on tax and on PRSI in this country if we are to plan strategically and smartly for the future. And I was intrigued earlier on at references made by Minister McGrath to the plans in the programme for government to create a series of well-being indicators to monitor the performance of this country, not just economically but socially and environmentally too. We've already written the legislation for them. Brendan Howlin did it in 2017. I updated it just a few short weeks ago. It's there for him, ready-made, and we will be asking him to support that legislation in the coming period of time. One of the huge gaps in this budget proposition today is the practical absence of a pathway to creating a better, more decent, fairer childcare model in this country. Ireland has the greatest reliance on private childcare services in the OECD, as well as a lower than average level of government investment. And none of that whatsoever has changed today. None of it at all. Today really is a missed opportunity to usher in what we might call a state-led childcare model. And we have in our alternative budget proposals, and we've been consistent on this because we did it last year and we did it in our election manifesto as well, we set aside €60 million as a first step to developing a universal public childcare system. Nothing is more important. I said earlier on, we have a huge over-reliance on the private sector to educate the youngest in our society, and we know that the advantages young people can get from good, decent early years education throughout their life and how it gives them an advantage before they get to school in terms of not just education but socialisation as well. And we need to look again at the provision of childcare in this country, or rather more appropriately termed early years education, because that's what it is. We have thousands of early years educators in this country who are seeking a living wage. Many of them earn barely above the national minimum wage. So many of them have education up to degree level and beyond, masters, and are earning less than €12 an hour. We have a system where the providers aren't satisfied, where parents are not satisfied because of the excessive costs, and workers are not satisfied either. This budget was a huge missed opportunity and shows a distinct lack of ambition about reshaping this society into a more decent, caring, fairer and more equal society. And nowhere is this more evident than the absence of any serious thinking on a publicly funded, public-facing, publicly produced childcare system. We in the Labour Party, Laskin Corla, we're a patriotic party. That doesn't mean that we go around waving flags at every opportunity. We are a patriotic party that is proud of the role that we have played in building up the institutions of this state and making this country fairer and more equal because of our actions and our role, not just in government over decades, but often in opposition as well, driving real change. We have always put our country and the interests of its people before the interests of our party. Today, we are in an unprecedented situation. People are worried for their health, they're worried for a job, they're worried for their businesses, they're worried for their families. And it isn't a time for opposition's sake. It's not a time for naked political opportunism. We leave that to others. The public health and economic emergency requires solidarity. And Minister, we will support measures that have been announced today and measures that government might choose to take over the next period of time that we think will work, and where we think measures won't work and where the sums don't add up, we will provide alternative solutions where your ideas and initiatives fall short. It would be, as I said at the outset, churlish to oppose every aspect of a budget that provides additional resources in their billions to provide better safety nets for people, provide assistance for businesses and to try to improve our health service. But nothing in this document assures me that we are on our way to creating a new social contract, a new understanding in this country, where people who pay their taxes and people who work hard get better basic universal public services. None whatsoever. This does not give me any confidence at all. At this time of national emergency, Minister, we want this government to be as ambitious for Ireland as we are, but the scale of our ambition is not matched by what we have seen today.